This is a continuation of the consultations that he is conducting with his counterparts from various countries in the region. It is in line with Iran's fundamental policy to strengthen relations and ties with neighboring countries. The policy of good neighborliness and regional strengthening is one of the pillars of our foreign policy, so you should view this trip within that framework. Besides, this trip had been planned in advance. Both the visit to Oman and his subsequent trip to Qatar are in this same context. The European Union and European countries are not in a position to impose themselves in diplomatic processes, unless they explicitly choose to characterize their own roles as inherently harmful and destructive actors, which would most definitely not provide any sort of advantage or benefit to any involved party at this time. While we have a profound sense of respect for the German people, for the rich heritage of German culture and their great civilization, we deeply and sincerely regret that those individuals currently representing Germany are occupying their current positions of power, who in no way represent the true spirit of the nation, adhere to the rules and even the minimum standards of international decorum, and also, because of the inappropriate decisions they have made, they have put this country and the entire European Union in a difficult position. They have deprived us of participation and constructive influence in diplomatic processes in our region.
Their vote in talks.
Also, considering that there are a vast multitude of various reports clearly indicating that the Zionist regime or several other countries are actively exploiting and utilizing these specific cases and fabrications in order to further promote and advance their own strategic and political agendas. This suspicion, this doubt, is reinforced by the idea that the whole story might have been a project, a very extensive and long-term project, to advance the political goals of certain parties, especially the Zionist regime. This is certainly something that analysts, politicians, and the general public will take into consideration.
Iran's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Esmaeil Baghaei on Tuesday publicly rejected European efforts to insert themselves into the ongoing nuclear negotiations between Tehran and Washington. Speaking at a press conference in Tehran, Baghaei stated that the European Union and European countries are not in a position to impose themselves in diplomatic processes unless they define themselves as a destructive force, which will certainly not be in the interest of any party. The remarks, reported by Al Jazeera and confirmed through the Associated Press, were directed at recent statements from France and Germany expressing their intent to shape the terms of any agreement between Iran and the United States. Baghaei's press conference covered multiple topics, including the Muscat talks, Ali Larajani's visit to Oman, and what he characterized as Europe's loss of credibility in Middle Eastern diplomacy due to its recent decisions. Baghaei reserved his sharpest language for Germany. While respecting the German people, their culture, and German civilization, he said, "We are sorry that the current representatives of Germany do not adhere to the regulations and minimum standards of international courtesy." He added that Germany and the entire European Union have been deprived of constructive participation and influence in diplomatic developments in our region due to the wrong decisions they have made. The statement was a direct continuation of a diplomatic confrontation that has been escalating since early February, when German Chancellor Friedrich Merz publicly called for increasing pressure on Tehran and engaging in talks aimed at bringing Iran's nuclear program to a swift end. Iran's foreign ministry had previously summoned the German ambassador to Tehran to protest what it described as interventionist and offensive remarks by Merz, according to Anadolu agency. Merz's original statement, posted on X during his Gulf tour, read, "We are ready to further increase the pressure and to engage in talks that serve the purpose of a swift end to the Iranian nuclear program." He also stated that developments in Iran stand in the way of cooperation with Persian Gulf states to promote peace in the region, and during the January protests had declared that if a regime can only hold on to power through violence, then it is effectively finished. These remarks crossed multiple red lines simultaneously from Tehran's perspective. They implied regime change, dismissed Iran's right to a peaceful nuclear program, and positioned Germany as an active participant in the pressure campaign rather than a neutral diplomatic partner. The Baghaei-Merz exchange built on an earlier and more personal confrontation between Foreign Minister Araghchi and the German Chancellor. In a post on X on February 5th, Araghchi wrote that Germany was once the engine of Europe's progress, but has now turned into an engine of regression. He criticized Merz for what he called political naivety and distasteful character, according to reporting from Anadolu Agency, Yahoo News, and the Jerusalem Post. Araghchi's core argument was structural. He stated that last September in New York, at Merz's insistence, the E3, meaning Britain, France, and Germany, put an end to their role in nuclear negotiations by pursuing the return of UN sanctions on Iran. Now, Araghchi wrote, Merz is begging to be allowed back into the same negotiations. The characterization frames Europe not as an excluded party, but as one that voluntarily abandoned its diplomatic role and now seeks re-entry after losing leverage. The E3 snapback decision is central to understanding Iran's position. In late August 2025, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom formally notified the UN Security Council of their intention to reinstate sanctions against Iran under the snapback mechanism of the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal, according to PBS and BC News and the Iris Research Institute. The E3 had demanded 3 conditions from Iran: resume negotiations with the United States, restore IAEA inspection access, and provide information on the location of its 60% enriched uranium stockpile. From Iran's perspective, the snapback decision, coming in the aftermath of the June 2025 war in which the United States struck Iran's nuclear facilities while talks were ongoing, represented what Tehran describes as a European betrayal. Iranian officials argued that the E3 were not legitimate in using the snapback mechanism, given that the 2015 deal had effectively been destroyed by the U.S. withdrawal in 2018 and the subsequent military strikes. The legal and diplomatic consequences of the snapback were significant. Under the mechanism, if no action was taken to stop it, all UN sanctions lifted under the JCPOA would be reinstated within 30 days. The E3 had offered to suspend the procedure for 6 months if Iran met their 3 conditions. Iran's refusal to comply on E3 terms, combined with the snapback trigger, effectively terminated what remained of the JCPOA framework and placed the nuclear file entirely in the bilateral US-Iran track. For Europe, the snapback was a final exercise of leverage. For Iran, it was the final proof that Europe had chosen sides. The JCPOA officially expired in October 2025 after Iran formally announced its termination, ending a decade-long diplomatic architecture that had once been celebrated as a landmark of multilateral diplomacy. The historical context explains why Baghaei's dismissal of Europe carries particular weight. The original 2015 JCPOA was negotiated between Iran and the P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, with the European Union serving as coordinator. Europe's role was central. France, Germany, and Britain were not merely participants, but architects of the framework. When Trump withdrew the United States from the deal in 2018, the E3 initially tried to preserve it through the INSTEX trade mechanism and diplomatic pressure on both Washington and Tehran. But that effort failed to deliver the economic benefits Iran expected, and relations deteriorated steadily. The June 2025 war effectively ended what remained of European credibility in Tehran's eyes. Iran viewed the E3 as having failed to prevent the U.S. withdrawal, failed to deliver on their economic commitments, and then having actively sided with the United States by pursuing the snapback of UN sanctions. France's position has been somewhat more nuanced than Germany's, though Tehran draws little distinction. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot stated that France supports diplomatic efforts aimed at reaching a negotiated solution with Iran, according to the video source. But he added a condition: any agreement must respect France's security concerns alongside the fundamental rights of the Iranian people. Barrot had previously warned in April 2025, according to the Times of Israel and Reuters, that if world powers were unable to reach a new agreement, a military confrontation seemed almost inevitable, a statement that reflected genuine European alarm at the prospect of war, but that Tehran interpreted as pressure rather than concern. More recently, Barrot warned that if European security interests are not guaranteed, France will not hesitate for a single second to reapply all the sanctions that were lifted 10 years ago. The gap between European rhetoric and European influence is the central dynamic of this story. France and Germany are calling for a role in shaping any nuclear agreement, but the actual negotiations are taking place bilaterally between Iran and the United States, mediated by Oman. The E3 are not at the table. They were not invited to Muscat. And Iran's public position is that their past decisions, particularly the snapback trigger, have disqualified them from constructive participation. Baghei's statement that European countries are not in a position to impose themselves is not merely a diplomatic barb. It reflects a structural reality. The current round of nuclear talks is being conducted without European participation, and Iran sees no reason to change that. The United States appears comfortable with this arrangement as well. The Trump administration, which withdrew from the JCPOA precisely because it viewed the multilateral format as having produced an inadequate deal, has shown no interest in bringing Europe back to the negotiating table. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has maintained close contact with E3 foreign ministers, but the substantive negotiations are being conducted through Witkoff and Kushner in Oman, not through multilateral forums. For the E3, this represents a fundamental loss of influence on one of the most consequential security issues affecting the European continent. Iran's ballistic missiles can reach European territory. A nuclear-armed Iran would transform the European security landscape. Yet Europe's voice in determining the outcome is, at present, non-existent. Merz's response to Araghchi's attacks revealed the depth of the rupture. Speaking during a visit to the Gulf region, where he met Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Qatari Emir Sheikh Tamim, Merz said he had seen Araghchi's tweet and could only say it seems to be a sign of great nervousness and insecurity, according to Kuwait Times. Merz was in the Gulf to sell Germany as a trade partner and pledged to take a less restrictive stance on arms exports to Gulf states, a positioning that further irritated Tehran. Iran views European arms sales to Gulf monarchies as part of the same pattern it identifies in U.S. arms sales to Taiwan and Israel, the use of weapons exports to build alliances that ultimately constrain Iran's regional position. The timing of Baghei's press conference coincided with a significant diplomatic development. Ali Larijani, Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council and former parliament speaker, traveled to Oman on Tuesday, according to the Associated Press. Larajani's entourage shared photos of him meeting with Omani Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi, and a letter was visible alongside the Omani flag, suggesting that Larajani carried Iran's formal response to the initial round of indirect talks held the previous week. Baghaei confirmed that the visit was part of regional consultations in line with Iran's fundamental policy of strengthening relations with neighboring countries, describing it as a pre-planned trip to Oman and subsequently to Qatar. However, the timing, just days after the Muscat talks and on the eve of Netanyahu's visit to Washington, makes the diplomatic significance unmistakable. Larajani's role is particularly noteworthy. As Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, he reports directly to the Supreme Leader and operates above the Foreign Ministry in Iran's decision-making hierarchy. His involvement signals that the nuclear negotiations have reached a level where decisions are being made at the highest echelons of the Islamic Republic's power structure, not merely at the diplomatic level. According to Al Jazeera, Larajani also accused Israel of trying to play a destructive role in the talks, a statement that aligns with Baghei's characterization of Israeli influence as the primary obstacle to a diplomatic resolution. Baghaei also provided details about the substance and format of the Muscat talks that are relevant to understanding why Iran is excluding Europe. According to reporting from the AP, the Washington Times, and Al Jazeera, Baghaei described the Muscat meeting as a half-day session primarily aimed at assessing the other side's seriousness. He said Iran's principles are clear. to secure the interests of the Iranian nation based on international norms and the Non-Proliferation Treaty and peaceful use of nuclear energy. He added that the next rounds of talks would continue in the same indirect format and that Iran was not planning to change the format of negotiations, according to TASS. The insistence on indirect talks, mediated through Oman, underscores Tehran's preference for a bilateral channel with Washington that does not include European intermediaries. Baghei's most provocative statement concerned the United States itself. According to Al Jazeera, he said Washington must act independently, free from the destructive pressures being exerted that harm the region and American interests. He urged the U.S. to resist Israeli pressure over the nuclear issue, claiming that one of the United States' problems in the region is its subservience to the demands of the Zionist entity, which is the primary factor destabilizing security in the region. He added that Israel has turned our nuclear program into an artificial crisis and is trying to raise unfounded fears about a nuclear bomb that does not exist in Iran. This framing positions Europe as irrelevant and Israel as the real obstacle, while casting the United States as a potentially reasonable interlocutor if it can free itself from external influence. The statement also reflects Iran's awareness that Netanyahu is traveling to Washington this week specifically to push Trump toward a harder line, including the expansion of nuclear talks to include ballistic missiles and proxy groups, issues that Iran has categorically refused to discuss. U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee told reporters there is extraordinary alignment between Washington and Israel over the talks with Tehran, a characterization that reinforces Iran's concern that the U.S. negotiating position is being shaped by Israeli priorities rather than by an independent assessment of American interests. The European exclusion from the Iran talks reflects a broader shift in Middle Eastern diplomacy. The 2015 JCPOA was a product of the post-Cold War multilateral order, in which European powers played a central role in managing regional security challenges alongside the United States, Russia, and China. That order has been progressively dismantled. Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018 demonstrated that European diplomatic investment could be undone by a single American decision. The June 2025 war demonstrated that European calls for restraint carried no weight when the United States and Israel decided to act. And the Snapback episode demonstrated that Europe's remaining leverage, its ability to reinstate UN sanctions, was a one-time card that, once played, left the E3 with nothing to offer and nothing to threaten. Araghchi's broader critique of European policy extends beyond the nuclear file. He accused European countries of actively fanning the flames during the January 2026 unrest in Iran, when widespread economic protests were met with a crackdown that left thousands dead, according to various estimates. The EU subsequently designated Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization, a move that further severed diplomatic ties. From Iran's perspective, Europe has simultaneously demanded inclusion in nuclear diplomacy, pursued the harshest available sanctions, designated a core element of Iran's security establishment as terrorist, and publicly cheered for regime change. These are not, in Tehran's view, the actions of a party seeking constructive engagement. They are the actions of an adversary demanding a seat at the table. The IRGC designation is a particularly sore point. The Revolutionary Guard is not merely a military force in Iran. It is deeply integrated into the country's economy, its political system, and its national security infrastructure. Designating the IRGC as a terrorist organization effectively criminalizes engagement with a vast portion of Iran's institutional framework and makes diplomatic normalization functionally impossible. For Tehran, the EU's decision to proceed with the designation while simultaneously demanding inclusion in nuclear talks represents a fundamental contradiction. Iran argues that Europe cannot designate its security establishment as terrorist and simultaneously expect to be treated as a good-faith diplomatic partner. Merz's specific record makes him a particularly easy target for Iranian criticism. According to Press TV and the Tehran Times, Merz expressed exuberance when Israel attacked Iran in June 2025, reportedly describing it as doing the dirty work for all of us. He subsequently stated publicly that Iran's government's days are numbered during the January protests. Iran's foreign ministry summoned the German ambassador over these remarks, and Araghchi's characterization of Merz as exhibiting political naivety reflects a deliberate strategy of personalizing the criticism to delegitimize the German government's position rather than engaging with its substance. By framing Merz as naive and distasteful rather than as a serious interlocutor, Tehran signals that it considers the current German leadership unworthy of diplomatic engagement on the nuclear issue. The question of whether European exclusion serves Iran's interests is more complex than Tehran's public rhetoric suggests. The 2015 JCPOA included European participation precisely because it provided Iran with multiple diplomatic channels and economic relationships that were not dependent on the United States alone. European companies, banks, and trade relationships were supposed to deliver the economic benefits that made the deal worthwhile for Iran. Without Europe in the current round of negotiations, Iran is negotiating exclusively with the United States, a partner it openly distrusts, mediated by Oman, a small Gulf state with limited leverage. If a deal is reached, its durability will depend partly on whether it has broader international backing that a future U.S. administration cannot simply revoke. Exactly the problem that destroyed the original JCPOA. By excluding Europe, Iran may be winning a rhetorical battle while weakening the structural foundations of any agreement. For now, however, Tehran's position is clear. Europe excluded itself through its own decisions. The failure to sustain the JCPOA after the U.S. withdrawal, the snapback trigger, the IRGC terrorist designation, and the public support for regime change. Baghaei, Araghchi, and Iran's broader diplomatic establishment are unified in the message that the E3 will not be given a seat at the table they voluntarily left. Whether that position is sustainable will depend on the outcome of the talks themselves. If the US and Iran reach an agreement without European participation, the E3's exclusion will become a permanent feature of the new Middle Eastern diplomatic landscape. If the talks fail and military escalation follows, Europe's absence may prove to have been not just a diplomatic setback, but a strategic catastrophe for Europe, for Iran, and for the prospects of a negotiated resolution to one of the world's most dangerous nuclear standoffs.